General Hospital will reveal while Michael was mentally bracing himself for the possibility that Nina might somehow sway the court in her favor. Manipulating the proceedings and painting him as an unfit parent, an unexpected twist unfolded with such startling abruptness that it seemed to paralyze the entire courtroom in suspended silence. Tension had been mounting for days, with both sides hurling accusations, dragging out secrets, and building elaborate narratives to convince the judge of their worthiness as custodians of Wiley and Amelia. But no one, absolutely no one, anticipated that the key voice to shift the entire trajectory of the trial would come from the smallest figure in the room. Wiley, the very child at the center of this emotional and legal tug-of-war, had quietly stood up and requested to speak. The courtroom, which had been echoing with sharp arguments and emotional testimonies, fell into stunned quietude as the judge granted the request. All eyes turned to the boy, some filled with concern, others with curiosity, but what they saw was not a frightened, confused child being manipulated by adults, but a composed, clear-eyed little boy with a purpose. He wasn't trembling. He wasn't crying. Instead, he stood with a surprising steadiness. His voice soft but resolute, and he began to speak, each word weighted with far more impact than anyone expected. In what would become the most pivotal testimony of the entire trial, Wiley confessed that he had overheard numerous private conversations between Nina and Drew. He didn't use big words, nor did he offer legal arguments, but his message was crystal clear. He spoke of feeling left out, of sensing that the warmth in the home he shared with Drew and Willow was conditional and inconsistent. He mentioned how he felt safer, happier, more loved when he was with Michael, how he could sense the tension and secrecy whenever Nina came around, especially in her interactions with Drew. He described, in his own simple but piercing way, the emotional discomfort of being caught in a web he couldn't fully understand but intuitively knew wasn't right. His final statement left the room breathless. He wanted to live with his father, not with Drew, not with Willow, not with Nina. With Michael. The impact was immediate and devastating for Nina. Her carefully crafted image of maternal concern and moral superiority shattered in real time. Her face, usually poised with self-assurance, now reflected a mix of disbelief, horror, and shame. Drew, who had managed to maintain a veneer of calm professionalism throughout the hearings, lowered his gaze and stared at the polished wood of the defense table, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Willow looked as if the air had been punched from her lungs. Her face went pale, her shoulders trembling ever so slightly as the words of her son echoed in her mind, cutting deeper than any cross-examination ever could. Meanwhile, Sasha remained composed, her expression unreadable, but her eyes shimmered with a complex swirl of emotions, vindication, sorrow, and a painful kind of triumph. She had endured months of being cast aside, of watching Nina exploit her past mistakes to gain favor with the court, all while carrying the burden of secrets she never wanted exposed. But in that moment, with Wiley's words turning the tide, she knew the truth had finally spoken for itself, through the most innocent voice possible. Wiley's testimony didn't just defend his own desire to live with the father he loved. It obliterated the very foundation Nina and Drew had built their case upon. What they had tried to keep buried, whispers, glances, late-night meetings, was now out in the open. And it had come from the mouth of a child. No opposing attorney could spin that. No strategic objection could reverse it. The weight of it was too real, too raw, and too damning. Rick, who had been orchestrating Nina's legal campaign with all the cunning of a seasoned tactician, seemed to age in a moment. He quietly nodded in acknowledgement of the admissibility of the testimony, though his expression betrayed the understanding that his case had just suffered a mortal blow. The judge, visibly affected by the turn of events, called for a recess to assess the full implications of Wiley's words. But even as the gavel struck the bench and the room slowly stirred back to motion, the atmosphere remained electric with disbelief. Nina sat frozen, her fingers clasped tightly, her nails digging into her palm. The carefully veiled romance between her and Drew, The clandestine alliance formed under the pretense of shared concern for Willow, had not only failed to serve her but had now become the very rope that tightened around her position. She had miscalculated. Gravely. And now, she wasn't just losing a legal battle, she was losing the trust of the very people she claimed to love. Willow, for her part, was thrust into emotional chaos. She had defended Drew, protected Nina's dignity even when it came at a cost to her relationship with Michael. But now, in the wake of Wiley's confession, she was forced to reevaluate everything, her judgment, her loyalty, and even her understanding of the environment she had helped shape for her children. And while Drew tried to comfort her, the words of the boy they both loved rang in her ears, louder than any reassurance he could offer. Outside the courtroom, the media would soon have a field day. But inside, those who mattered most, Michael, Sasha, Wiley, had already won a different kind of battle. One not for headlines, but for truth. Michael, who had spent sleepless nights anticipating the worst, finally felt the weight on his chest begin to lift. Not because he had delivered a brilliant argument, but because his son had spoken from the heart. It was a kind of justice that no legal precedent could deliver. And as the courtroom emptied, Nina remained seated, unable to move. Because for her, the damage was done, not just to her case, but to her relationships, to her image, to whatever fragile bond she once had with a boy who now saw her as someone he couldn't trust. The silence left in the wake of Wiley's words would linger far longer than the court's final ruling. No one in that courtroom could have foreseen that the very child they had all quietly labeled as fragile, impressionable, and easily manipulated would be the one to deliver the most devastating blow to Nina's carefully calculated plan. Wiley, whose soft-spoken demeanor had often been mistaken for naivety, shattered that illusion with a few measured, heartfelt words that carried more impact than any cross-examination or lawyer's closing argument ever could. His testimony pierced through the walls of deception, turning Rick's intricate legal strategy into little more than a crumbling tower of misguided ambition. The truth Wiley revealed didn't just dismantle the case, it exposed the rotting core beneath Nina's pursuit of custody, a pursuit built on betrayal, control, and the weaponization of secrets. Suddenly, all of Rick's precision, all of Nina's emotional manipulation, and Drew's silent complicity amounted to nothing. The courtroom, once divided and volatile, found common clarity in the innocent but brutally honest words of a child. Wiley's quiet courage was the very force that tipped the scale, unpredictable and undeniable. For Sasha, this moment was a vindication long overdue. The heartbreak she had silently carried, the sting of being sacrificed by the woman she once saw as a mother, the humiliation of having her truth buried to preserve someone else's power, was no longer just her private suffering. Wiley had unearthed it, validated it, and held it up for the world to see. It wasn't just about custody anymore. It was about justice. About reclaiming dignity stolen in whispered betrayals and calculated silences. What made Nina's actions even more reprehensible was the fact that she had long known about Michael and Sasha's history, knew the child's origins and the vulnerability of the situation. And instead of shielding that child from exploitation, she chose to use the truth like a poker chip, a weapon of leverage to keep Sasha compliant, fearful, and quiet. It wasn't love. It wasn't maternal instinct. It was control, masked in the guise of care, and it had finally been dragged into the harsh light of truth. Willow sat paralyzed, as though every emotion had been drained from her body, leaving only a hollow stillness. Her world, already fragile from strained loyalties, now teetered on the edge of collapse. She had defended Drew, believed in Nina's redemptive arc, and tried to build a family from fractured pieces. But with Wiley's revelation, the fragile image she had constructed of her future shattered completely. Her silence now wasn't defiance or resilience, it was the numbness of realization, of loss too great to articulate. Drew, who had once appeared so measured and dependable, had nothing left to say. Words would be futile now. The truth of his relationship with Nina, previously buried under the pretense of comfort and emotional support, was no longer a rumor or suspicion. It was a confirmed public reality. One that no longer allowed him the dignity of denial or explanation. The scandal of their affair, once whispered behind closed doors, now rang loud within the courtroom. And with it came judgment, silent but palpable, from every corner of the room. And with all of that laid bare, the moral compass of the proceedings shifted. It wasn't just about legal precedent or parental rights anymore, it was about integrity, about who had truly acted in the best interest of the child. Nina's actions, however well spun by Rick, could not withstand the truth. Not when that truth came from Wiley's own lips. Not when the facts revealed a betrayal so intimate, so personal, that it echoed through the courtroom like a bell of reckoning. The judge, whose patience had been tested by weeks of convoluted claims and veiled accusations, now saw things with absolute clarity. The decision, once mired in complexity, suddenly became obvious. In a voice firm with finality, he granted full primary custody to Michael. It was a moment of silence and stillness, but for Nina, it might as well have been a thunderclap. Her knees buckled, and her face fell, her world collapsing in real time. Every manipulative move, every whispered scheme, every calculated risk had led to this, complete, public, and humiliating defeat. It wasn't just that she lost the case. She lost the moral high ground. She lost the respect of the court. She lost the fragile connection she had tried to rebuild with Willow. But most devastatingly of all, she lost the trust of the child who had once clung to her hand and called her Grandma. Wiley's eyes, once filled with innocence and hope, now saw her clearly. And what he saw was not someone who protected him, but someone who betrayed him. For Sasha, there was no gloating. No celebration. The cost of this justice was too high for victory laps. But in the quiet, in the stillness that followed the judge's decision, she finally breathed freely. Not because she had won, but because the lies had finally ended. And perhaps, in that painful honesty, she and Michael could begin to rebuild, not just a custody agreement, but a foundation of truth, love, and resilience strong enough to withstand even the deepest betrayals. And as the courtroom slowly emptied, Nina remained seated, her hands trembling, her gaze hollow. The echo of Wiley's testimony still rang in her ears, drowning out the chaos around her. She had come seeking victory. She left with silence, shame, and the irreversible knowledge that the child she fought so hard to possess now wanted nothing to do with her. The victory that Michael and Sasha achieved on that fateful day in court was not merely a legal triumph, it was something far deeper, far more profound. It was a restoration of principles that had long been buried beneath layers of deceit, manipulation, and half-truths. It was a testament to the enduring power of honesty, unconditional love, and the unbreakable strength that comes from choosing what is right over what is convenient. In a courtroom that had become a battleground of egos and secrets, the verdict served as a quiet declaration that authenticity still mattered, that the truth, no matter how deeply it had been buried or how painfully it had been obscured, would always find a way to surface. Michael stood at the center of that affirmation, no longer the man shadowed by legal intimidation or emotional manipulation, but a father vindicated, not just in the eyes of the court, but in the heart of his son. He had not been perfect. He had faltered, doubted, made compromises, but he had also held firm in his love for Wiley. His resolve had never wavered when it came to protecting his child, and now, with custody firmly placed back in his hands, he could finally breathe without the weight of constant threat. More importantly, he could begin to mend the emotional fissures left behind by the battle. But if Michael was the victor on paper, then Sasha was the spiritual heart of the victory. For months, she had lived under the burden of silence, of guilt, of threats, held hostage by the knowledge that any attempt to defend herself could be twisted, dismissed, or used against her. She had endured character assassination, betrayal, An emotional exile at the hands of someone she once loved and trusted as a mother. And yet, despite all that, she never retaliated with venom. She waited. She watched. She endured. And when the truth finally emerged, when it came not from her lips, but from the clarity of a child's voice, she stood tall. Her silence had not been weakness. It had been strength in its purest, most courageous form. Now, with the courtroom nearly emptied and the gavel's echo fading into memory, Sasha no longer needed to hide. She could stand tall with her dignity intact, knowing that her pain had not been in vain. She had won not only custody and justice but freedom, from fear, from manipulation, and from the emotional chains Nina had tried to wrap around her. It was not revenge that brought her peace, but the validation that everything she had believed, everything she had protected in quiet defiance, had finally been recognized. She had won not only through the law, but through her resilience, her integrity, and her unwavering belief in the truth. Nina, by contrast, now sat alone amid the silence she once filled with forceful arguments and rehearsed emotion. The courtroom, which had moments earlier buzzed with tension and anticipation, now felt cavernous around her, cold, indifferent, and unforgiving. Her eyes lingered on the empty chair where Wiley had sat, remembering the child's words that pierced through every illusion she had tried to sustain. The heartbreak on his face, the way he refused to look back at her, had spoken volumes. In that moment, Nina was not a mother, not a protector, not a woman wronged, but a figure broken by her own design. She had once fought with fire and passion for the people she loved. But somewhere along the way, her battles ceased to be about love and became about control, about winning, no matter the cost. And the cost had been high. She had lost not just the case, but the essence of the relationships she fought so hard to control. The child she claimed to love had rejected her, not out of confusion or manipulation, but from a deep, painful awareness that the love he had been given was conditional and performative. And perhaps even more devastating was the silent condemnation from Sasha, the woman she once called daughter, who now stood in quiet triumph, no longer needing Nina's approval, nor her apology. It wasn't the loss in court that destroyed Nina, it was the realization that she had orchestrated her own downfall. Every lie she told, every secret she guarded, every emotional string she pulled had not protected her, it had isolated her. She had believed herself the architect of a greater good, but in truth, she had built a fortress of betrayal and self-delusion, and now she stood alone among its ruins. The courtroom may have cleared, and the judge's ruling may have concluded the legal proceedings. But the consequences of what happened that day would echo far beyond its walls. Wiley's voice, calm, sincere, and devastatingly honest, had exposed not just hidden truths, but the moral failures of the adults who had used him as a pawn in their battle. His testimony reminded everyone present that children see more than they are given credit for, that their hearts are not blind to falsehoods, and that their voices, however young, carry undeniable weight when they speak the truth. For Michael and Sasha, life would not instantly return to normal. There would be healing to do, wounds to tend to, and trust to rebuild. But they would do so on their own terms, unburdened by secrecy. No longer under the shadow of Nina's interference. Their victory was not a triumphant shout, but a quiet reclaiming of their humanity, their strength, and their right to build a future free from manipulation. As for Nina, her path forward was uncertain. Whether she would reflect, repent, or retreat remained to be seen. But what was certain was that the mirror had been held up to her, and what stared back was not a savior or a victim, but a woman undone by her own refusal to let go. In trying to control the narrative, she had lost the plot entirely. And thus, in the silence that followed Wiley's testimony, in the truth laid bare not by lawyers but by a child's simple plea to be with the parent he trusted most, every lie unraveled, every scheme collapsed, and every justification turned to dust. The legal battle ended that day, but the moral reckoning would live on in the hearts of all who had been there to witness it.